So if you're like me, you're going to be confused by all these terms like cocoa, cacao, what's the difference? And then there's all these weird prefixes in front of them like raw or Dutched. And then we've got all these weird debates about why some Europeans don't think that Brits and Americans make chocolate. We'll try and answer those. And let me start with the easy one. What's the difference between cocoa and cacao, other than the spelling? Well, there really isn't an official difference. What most people would argue is that cacao is what happens on the farm, and then cocoa is what happens afterwards. What you want to be a bit more careful with is some of the prefixes, some of the words that get put before cocoa, like, for example, raw. That's an utterly meaningless nonsense piece of marketing speak. Look on the website for more. Much more worrying to me is alkalinized. So alkalinized is basically what's called Dutch chocolate, invented by the Van Houten family. This is actually by the son, Cornelius, and what he worked out is that if you wash cocoa powder in an alkaline solution, it goes a different color, goes a bit redder, it becomes a lot less bitter, but most importantly, it becomes a lot more water soluble. So a lot of the cocoa powder that you'll find for baking with or for having hot chocolate with, etc., is actually going to be alkalinized. Now in the US, this has to be said on the label, but in Europe, Big Chocolate managed to lobby against it. So you want to be really careful because there are some really serious health and nutritional downsides, we believe, from Dutching cacao. So for example, you're going to lose some of the flavonols, you're going to lose some of the antioxidants, the theobromine quality will be done. So, just be a bit careful. Don't worry about cacao and cocoa. Just look a little bit more at the prefixes. And if you don't see a prefix, be worried. What you're looking for is the sort of great natural stuff. So for example, the stuff that Chocolada or Coca Camille or Chocolate Madagascar do, and it'll just give you a much better cake, give you a much better ice cream, give you a much better hot chocolate. Right, now let's move on to the fun one. Why do some Europeans, in particular I'm thinking of our friends the French, but also the Germans and the Swiss, all basically insist that British and Americans often don't make chocolate? So the reason for this is that if you go back a little bit and you look at the definitions of chocolate, they are unbelievably confusing. So for a start, what percentage you have to qualify as white or milk or dark chocolate will differ by country. We've got a whole table on this on the website. In addition to that, what you're allowed to include, in addition to cocoa butter, sugar, and obviously the cocoa mass, the cocoa itself, differs hugely between countries. It used to be that in Europe, France, Germany, etc., they believed that you could not add any other form of butter or any other form of fat or any other artificial ingredient, although you were allowed emulsifiers, to your chocolate and still call it chocolate. And that's why they accuse the Brits and the Americans of basically using vegelat. The Brits, from the get-go, something like dairy milk, if you look at the extraordinary list of ingredients which they use to make it back in its patent, you will see all sorts of things like sort of mango gum and palm syrup and all that sort of stuff. And it really is not necessarily what you'd naturally expect. The American situation is a lot more complicated because officially the American definition of chocolate is for a much lower amount, for example, of milk chocolate, so only like 10% versus the 20 or 25% in the UK and Europe. But what's really different is the Americans insist that officially you can't use anything but cocoa butter. However, if you look at the label and the ingredients of any American chocolate bar, you'll find things like PGPR or palm oil, etc. So what's going on here? What the Americans did was they basically said that you can have processing agents, so things which change the mouthfeel, like palm oil, or things which make the machines run better, and still call it chocolate. So it's really, really confusing. And then one final point, to add insult to injury, Big Chocolate used this fact of percentages because they're so low. So even in dark chocolate, it's still a very, very low percentage. It's like 35% in most countries. And they use this percentage to argue that because chocolate isn't the primary ingredient in a chocolate bar, you don't need to obey any of the rules about country of origin. So look, don't get hung up on the words, just go for craft chocolate. Tastes better, much more flavour, much better for the farmers. It's all about transparency. It's not about trying to hide behind weird and wacky rules or using marketing speak. Thank you.